When my family called me a disgrace at my father's funeral, I stayed silent. When they said I was a failure who deserved nothing, I bit my tongue. But when my cousin threatened my 10-year-old son, saying, "He's next," that's when my boy stood up and said 5 words that made everyone in that room go white as sheets. I'm Zara Hoffman, and 3 years ago, I became the black sheep of one of the wealthiest families in Chicago. My sister Brooke married a Wall Street executive and became the golden child. My uncle Dexter managed our family's investment portfolio and earned my father's respect through pure greed. His son Jet grew up thinking cruelty was a birthright. And then, there's my son Knox, the smartest 10-year-old I've ever known, who sees everything with those sharp eyes he inherited from his grandfather. My father, Palmer, built an empire from nothing, but he also built walls around his heart. When I chose love over money and independence over control, those walls became prison bars that kept me out of the family I was born into. I thought I'd lost everything when I walked away from their toxic world to raise Knox on my own terms. I had no idea that my father had been watching every move, recording every cruel word, and planning something that would change everything. The day of his will reading, I walked into that mahogany-paneled law office expecting nothing but insults. What I got instead was a masterclass in justice served cold, delivered by the most unlikely messenger imaginable. My own son held the key to a secret that would expose my family's true nature and flip our entire world upside down. What happened in that conference room wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about a grandfather's love, a mother's strength, and a little boy's courage to stand up to adults who thought they could crush anyone in their path. By the time that screen turned on and my father's voice filled the room, everyone realized they had seriously underestimated the 2 people they'd spent years trying to break. The morning of my father's will reading, I stood in front of my tiny apartment's cracked mirror, trying to decide if I should even bother showing up. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks after Palmer Hoffman's funeral, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be standing in my run-down neighborhood. Knox watched me from the doorway, already dressed in his best shirt and tie, the same outfit he'd worn to his grandfather's funeral where half the family pretended we didn't exist. "Mom, we have to go," he said with that serious tone that made him sound older than his 10 years. Grandpa specifically asked for us to be there. I wanted to laugh at the irony. My father had barely spoken to me in 3 years, ever since I'd refused his ultimatum to move back home and let him control every aspect of Knox's upbringing. He'd made it clear that my independence was a personal insult, that raising a mixed-race grandson without his guidance was somehow damaging the precious Hoffman legacy. The last conversation we'd had ended with him calling me stubborn, and me calling him controlling. Neither of us had been wrong. The law offices of Sterling, Martinez, and Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where every surface gleamed and the air smelled like expensive leather and old money. Knox held my hand as we walked through the marble lobby, his small fingers squeezing mine when the receptionist's smile faltered at our appearance. My simple black dress from Target looked like exactly what it was next to the designer suits and diamond jewelry filling the waiting room. "Mrs. Hoffman Whitmore and Mr. Hoffman are already here," the receptionist informed us, her voice carefully neutral. Of course they were. Brooke had probably arrived early to stake her claim, and Uncle Dexter never missed an opportunity to discuss money with lawyers. The conference room felt like a courtroom designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and a massive oak table dominated the space beneath a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than I made in a year. Brooke sat at the far end wearing a cream Chanel suit, her perfectly highlighted hair pulled back in a style that screamed expensive salon. She glanced up when we entered, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to barely concealed disdain. "Well, look who decided to show up," she murmured to Uncle Dexter, who occupied the chair beside her like he owned it. My father's younger brother had always been bitter about being born second, and Palmer's success had only deepened that resentment. He wore his usual smug expression, the one that suggested he knew something you didn't and enjoyed keeping you in the dark. Jet sprawled in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never worked for anything in his life. At 28, he still lived off his trust fund and spent his days playing video games in his downtown condo. He looked up from his phone long enough to smirk at Knox, an expression that made my protective instincts flare. "Aunt Zara," he said with mock surprise, "I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show your face here." I guided Knox to two empty chairs on the opposite side of the table, trying to ignore the weight of their stares. My son sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, watching everyone with those intelligent dark eyes that had always reminded me of my father. Palmer used to say Knox had an old soul, back when he still talked to us. Now I wondered if that old soul was the only thing in this room that truly understood what was about to happen. The lawyer, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, entered carrying a thick folder. "Thank you all for coming," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time for the family." Brooke straightened, already preparing to accept her inheritance graciously. Uncle Dexter leaned forward, his calculator brain no doubt running numbers. Jet continued scrolling through his phone, confident that his piece of the Hoffman fortune was guaranteed. I felt like an intruder at my own father's will reading, surrounded by people who'd made it clear I didn't belong. Knox's small hand found mine under the table, offering comfort I didn't deserve. He'd been Palmer's secret favorite, I suspected, though my father had never said as much. They'd shared a love of chess and old movies, and sometimes I'd catch them having conversations that seemed too deep for a grandfather and his young grandson. As the lawyer began organizing his papers, I braced myself for public humiliation. I'd come expecting nothing and prepared to leave with less. What I couldn't have predicted was that my father had spent the last months of his life orchestrating the most elaborate lesson in family loyalty I'd ever witnessed, with my 10-year-old son as his willing accomplice. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and opened the leather-bound folder with the reverence reserved for documents worth millions. "We're here today to read the last will and testament of Palmer James Hoffman," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years practicing estate law. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and Jet's fingers still tapping against his phone screen. "To my beloved daughter, Brooke Hoffman Whitmore," the lawyer read, "who has always understood the importance of family reputation and social standing, I leave the sum of $15 million, along with the Aspen property and all contents therein." Brooke's face lit up with satisfaction, though she tried to maintain a dignified composure. She reached over and squeezed her husband's hand, already mentally redecorating their third vacation home. "To my brother, Dexter Hoffman, who has faithfully managed the family investments for the past 20 years, Mr. Sterling continued, I leave $10 million and the controlling interest in Hoffman Financial Management." Uncle Dexter's smugness deepened as he nodded approvingly. He'd been waiting decades for official recognition of his contributions to the family wealth. The lawyer proceeded through a list of cousins, distant relatives, and family friends, each receiving generous 5- and 6-figure sums. The Palmer Hoffman I remembered had been methodical about everything, and his will reflected that same careful attention to detail. Every name mentioned brought nods of approval from the family members present, as if they were grading his choices. 20 minutes passed, then 30. My name hadn't been mentioned once. Brooke's patience finally cracked. "I'm sorry," she interrupted, her voice dripping with false concern. "But are we going to be here all day? Some of us have actual responsibilities to attend to." Her eyes flicked toward me with unmistakable meaning. The unspoken message was clear, unlike some people who apparently had nothing better to do with their time. Mr. Sterling looked up from the document. "That concludes the reading of Palmer Hoffman's last will and testament. Are there any questions?" The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Knox's hand tightened around mine, and I could feel his tension even though his expression remained perfectly calm. I'd prepared myself for this moment, but hearing it, made official, still felt like a punch to the gut. Brooke couldn't contain her glee any longer. "Well," she said, her voice bright with vindication, "what did you expect, really? Dad always said you were a disgrace to the family name." She turned to face me directly, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the cruelty in her eyes. "Walking away from everything he built, throwing away every opportunity he gave you, raising that child like some kind of charity case instead of a Hoffman. Uncle Dexter chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. Palmer saw right through your little rebellion, Zara. All those years you spent trying to prove you didn't need family money, and what do you have to show for it? A cramped apartment and a freelance career that barely pays the bills. He shook his head with mock sympathy. A failure till the end, just like he always predicted you'd be. The words hit harder than I'd expected. I'd known they thought these things, but hearing them spoken aloud in this formal setting made them feel like legal judgments rather than family opinions. My face burned with humiliation, not for myself, but for Knox, who was absorbing every cruel word his relatives were throwing at his mother. Jet, emboldened by the adult's cruelty, finally looked up from his phone. He stared directly at Knox with the kind of calculating meanness that bullies perfect in middle school, but never outgrow. "You know what the really sad part is?" he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "It's not just her. Look at him sitting there pretending like he belongs in a room like this." Knox's posture remained perfectly straight, but I felt him tense beside me. Jet's smile grew wider as he continued his attack. "Guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? She's been a disappointment her whole life, and now she's raising the next generation of family failures." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a whisper, but was clearly intended for everyone to hear. "Face it, kid. You're next in line to be the family disappointment. Might as well get used to it now." That's when something inside me finally snapped. I started to stand, ready to tell them exactly what I thought of their cruelty, ready to grab Knox and walk out of this toxic environment forever. But before I could move, before I could speak, my 10-year-old son did something that stopped me cold. Knox stood up on his chair, his small frame suddenly commanding the attention of every adult in that room, and spoke with a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his years. Knox rose from his chair with the kind of deliberate calm that made everyone in the room stop talking. At 10 years old, he barely reached my shoulder even when standing, but something about his posture commanded attention in a way that reminded me painfully of my father. The similarity was so striking that Brooke actually gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she'd seen a ghost. "My grandpa recorded something for this exact moment," Knox announced, his voice clear and steady despite being surrounded by adults who just finished tearing his mother apart. The conference room fell completely silent. Even Jet stopped smirking, confusion replacing the cruel satisfaction on his face. Uncle Dexter leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, boy?" "Recorded what?" Knox reached into the pocket of his dress pants and pulled out a small black remote control, the kind used for smart TVs and media systems. I stared at it in complete bewilderment. I'd never seen it before in my life, and I certainly had no idea why my son would be carrying around electronics to his grandfather's will reading. "Grandpa gave this to me 3 weeks before he died," Knox explained, holding the remote up so everyone could see it. "He came to our apartment when Mom was at the grocery store. He said he had something very important to tell me, something that had to stay secret until today." My heart stopped. My father had visited our apartment? When? How had I not known? I tried to remember any unexplained absences, any moments when Knox might have been alone, but my mind was reeling too much to think clearly. Brooke's voice cracked with disbelief. "That's impossible. Dad wouldn't have gone to that neighborhood. He wouldn't have—" He said to press this button when Aunt Brooke called my mom a disgrace, and Uncle Dexter laughed about it, Knox continued, completely ignoring her interruption. "He told me to wait for those exact words because he knew you'd say them. He knew exactly what you'd do." The remote control suddenly felt ominous in Knox's small hands. Mr. Sterling looked as confused as the rest of us, his professional composure cracking as he tried to understand what was happening. This was clearly not part of the standard will reading protocol he'd followed for decades. Knox turned to face the large flat-screen television mounted on the conference room wall, a display I'd assumed was used for presentations and legal documents. His movement was confident, like he'd practiced this moment, like he knew exactly what he was doing. "Grandpa said some people need to hear the truth before they can inherit anything," Knox said, his words carrying a weight that seemed impossible for someone his age. He said the real will reading couldn't happen until everyone showed who they really were. The real will reading? My mind struggled to process what that could mean. Had everything we just witnessed been some kind of elaborate setup? The generous distributions to Brooke and Uncle Dexter, the conspicuous absence of my name, the cruel comments that followed. Had my father somehow orchestrated all of it? Jet jumped up from his chair, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. You can't just waltz in here with some random remote and— Sit down, Jet, Mr. Sterling said quietly, but with enough authority to make the younger man comply. The lawyer's expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching fascination. Let the boy finish. Knox's fingers moved over the remote with practiced ease, finding buttons he clearly understood. The television screen flickered to life, casting a blue glow across the mahogany table. I watched my son's face in that light, seeing determination and sadness and something else I couldn't quite identify. Love, maybe, or justice. Mom, Knox said, turning to look at me directly for the first time since this strange scene had begun. Grandpa wanted me to tell you something before we watch this. He said he was sorry for all the times he made you feel like you weren't good enough. He said he was proud of you for choosing to be a good person instead of choosing to be rich. Tears stung my eyes. Those words coming from my son, but clearly originating from my father, hit me harder than any inheritance could have. Palmer Hoffman had been many things, but he'd never been good at apologies or expressions of pride. Hearing them now, delivered through the grandchild he'd claimed to disapprove of, felt like a miracle, and a tragedy rolled into one. Knox raised the remote toward the screen, his finger hovering over what I assumed was the play button. The adults around the table sat frozen, caught between disbelief and a growing sense that something monumental was about to happen. Grandpa said this would be the most important family meeting we'd ever have, Knox said. He said after we watch this, everything would be different. Then he pressed the button. The screen flickered from blue to black, then suddenly my father's face filled the display with startling clarity. Palmer Hoffman sat in his home office, the same mahogany desk and leather chair I remembered from childhood visits, but his appearance shocked me. This wasn't the frail, sick man I'd seen at the hospital. This was my father as I'd known him in his prime, sharp-eyed, commanding, and very much in control. If you're watching this, Palmer said, looking directly into the camera with those piercing eyes Knox had inherited, it means my family has just shown their true colors at my will reading. Brooke, Dexter, Jet, I heard every word you just said. The room went deadly silent. Brooke's face drained of color so quickly, I thought she might faint. Uncle Dexter's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Jet looked like he'd been slapped. Palmer continued, his voice carrying the same authority it had possessed in boardrooms and family dinners for decades. The will you just heard was fake, a performance designed to reveal exactly who you've become when you thought no one was watching. Congratulations, you've exceeded even my lowest expectations. Mr. Sterling dropped his pen, the small sound echoing in the stunned silence. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. A fake will? How was that even possible? Mr. Sterling, Palmer addressed the lawyer directly, please retrieve the real will from the safe. Authorization code 774 Knox Zara. My grandson knows the numbers. Knox nodded solemnly. 77489679, he recited from memory. I realized with a start that those numbers spelled out his name and mine on a phone keypad. My father had always been clever with codes. The lawyer stood on shaking legs and moved to a wall safe I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a false panel. As he input the numbers, Palmer's voice filled the silence. Zara, you're probably wondering why I put you through this humiliation. The answer is simple. I needed them to prove who they really were. I needed you to see that walking away from this family wasn't a mistake. It was the smartest thing you ever did. Tears streamed down my face as Mr. Sterling returned with a different folder, this one sealed with red wax bearing my father's signet ring. Palmer's recorded image leaned forward, his expression softening in a way I hadn't seen since I was Knox's age. You're the only one who never asked me for money, Zara. Never expected an inheritance. Never compromised your values for my approval. You chose love over luxury, integrity over influence. That's exactly why you're getting everything, Brooke screamed. Actually screamed, a sound of pure rage and disbelief that echoed off the conference room walls. "No, this can't be legal. You can't just—" "Mr. Sterling will confirm the legality." Palmer's voice cut through her protests, as if he'd anticipated this exact reaction. "The real will leaves Zara my entire estate, $53 million, all properties, all business interests, all investments, everything." Uncle Dexter found his voice stammering with fury. "This is fraud, conspiracy. We'll contest this in court." Palmer chuckled on screen, the sound both warm and cold. "You're welcome to try, Dexter. I spent the last 6 months of my life building an ironclad legal case. Every conversation, every cruel comment about Zara and Knox at family gatherings, I recorded it all. Your lawyers will have a field day explaining to a jury why you deserve money after calling a 10-year-old boy a future failure." Knox squeezed my hand as Palmer's attention turned to him on screen. "Knox, my boy, you've been the perfect messenger. These past months, watching you visit me in secret, seeing how you handled this responsibility, you've shown more character at 10 than the rest of them combined." The secret visits suddenly made sense. Knox's mysterious walks in our neighborhood, his unexpected knowledge of chess strategies, the way he'd sometimes hum songs I didn't recognize. My father had been teaching him, preparing him, building a relationship I'd never known existed. Palmer's final words hit the room like a physical force. "Brooke, you get nothing because you've spent your life believing you deserved everything without earning it. Dexter, you get nothing because you turned bitterness into an art form. Jet, you get nothing because you're cruel to children, which tells me everything I need to know about your character." The screen went black, leaving us all staring at our reflections in the dark glass. Mr. Sterling's hands shook as he broke the wax seal on the real will, but his voice was steady as he confirmed what we'd just heard. "The estate of Palmer James Hoffman in its entirety goes to his daughter Zara Hoffman, with Knox Hoffman named as sole heir upon her death. The document is legally binding and witnessed by 3 independent attorneys." I sat in stunned silence as my family's world collapsed around me, finally understanding that my father's greatest gift wasn't the money. It was showing me that choosing love over wealth had been right all along. The conference room erupted into chaos the moment Palmer's face disappeared from the screen. Brooke shot out of her chair so fast she knocked over her water glass, sending crystal and liquid cascading across the mahogany table. "This is insane!" she shrieked, her perfect composure completely shattered. $53 million to her? She doesn't even have a real job. Uncle Dexter's face had turned an alarming shade of purple as he jabbed his finger at Mr. Sterling. "I don't care what that screen said. I've been managing those investments for 20 years. You can't just give everything to someone who's never even balanced a checkbook." Jet paced behind his chair like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair. "This has to be some kind of mistake. Grandpa was sick, maybe confused. People with dementia do crazy things with their money all the time." Mr. Sterling remained remarkably calm as he spread the real will across the table, pointing to official seals and signatures. "I can assure you that Palmer Hoffman was completely lucid when he created this document. In fact, he anticipated your reactions and took extensive precautions." The lawyer opened another folder, revealing thick stacks of paper. He spent 6 months documenting every interaction with family members, including audio recordings of conversations at holiday gatherings, birthday parties, and casual visits. My stomach dropped as I remembered some of those gatherings, the snide comments about my apartment, the jokes about Knox's mixed heritage, the constant reminders that I'd thrown away my birthright. I'd thought those conversations were just typical family dysfunction. I'd never imagined my father was building a legal case. The recordings clearly demonstrate a pattern of verbal abuse directed toward both Zara and Knox, Mr. Sterling continued. "Any attempt to contest this would require explaining those recordings to a jury. I suspect your legal counsel will advise against that course of action." Brooke's perfect makeup was streaking down her face as reality sank in. She'd just lost $15 million and a vacation home because she couldn't keep her cruelty to herself for 30 minutes. Uncle Dexter slumped in his chair, his dreams of controlling the family fortune crumbling before his eyes. Jet just stared at Knox with something approaching disbelief, as if he couldn't understand how a 10-year-old had outmaneuvered 3 adults. Knox climbed into my lap, whispering words that hit me harder than any dollar amount ever could. Grandpa said you deserved to know how proud he was. He said you were the only one who remembered that money should make people kinder, not meaner. I held my son close, breathing in the scent of his hair and trying to process what had just happened. My father, the man I'd thought disapproved of every choice I'd made, had been watching and planning and preparing to vindicate everything I'd stood for. The inheritance wasn't just about money, it was about validation from beyond the grave. 6 months later, I barely recognized my life. The foundation I'd started, Hoffman House, had helped over 200 single mothers find stable housing and job training. Knox attended the best private school in Chicago, but he'd insisted on a scholarship program that brought kids from our old neighborhood into the same classrooms as politicians' children. Every morning, he still carried that remote control in his backpack, not because he needed it anymore, but because it reminded him that standing up for what's right matters even when you're small. Brooke and Uncle Dexter had hired lawyers, just as Palmer predicted, but the recordings made their case impossible. Hearing themselves mock a 10-year-old child on audio had been sobering enough that they'd dropped the contest within weeks. Jet had moved to California, claiming he needed a fresh start away from family drama. I suspected he was just embarrassed that a fourth grader had exposed him as a bully in front of a room full of adults. The greatest inheritance wasn't the millions in my bank account or the properties I now owned. It was learning that my father had seen my strength all along, that he'd understood the courage it took to choose integrity over easy money. Palmer Hoffman had spent his final months crafting the most elaborate lesson in family values I'd ever witnessed, using my own son as his messenger and my family's cruelty as the trigger. Knox and I still lived simply, though our apartment was bigger now and in a safer neighborhood. We'd learned that having money didn't mean you had to become money. The remote control that had changed our lives sat on Knox's desk next to his homework, a daily reminder that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that choosing kindness over wealth always pays the biggest dividends. Comment below with your own stories about family loyalty and unexpected justice. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that prove love really does conquer all.